Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today, we're digging into the first two Pierce Brosnan James Bond movies. In fact, we're going to pit them against each other in a bit of a cage match. So here, we're pitting Goldeneye against Tomorrow Never Dies. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to say that if you're not following me on Instagram, you should be, because this has been the culmination of a week-long look at Tomorrow Never Dies. So if you are curious about my thoughts about this film, its various facets, hop on over to Instagram. I have a week's worth of posts just breaking down different aspects of Tomorrow Never Dies. But today, we're specifically focused on the head-to-head with Goldeneye. Goldeneye is the obvious favorite coming into this head-to-head match. In fact, I've generally cited Goldeneye as the best film of the Pierce Brosnan run, and that generally seems to be the consensus. However, I've revisited Goldeneye in the recent past, and I have to admit, I came away from it feeling a little bit more lukewarm than I have in past decades. That made me excited to revisit Tomorrow Never Dies. I've run hot and cold on Tomorrow Never Dies over the years, but it holds a special place in my heart. 1997 was the year that I really became aware of James Bond as a character, and I saw Tomorrow Never Dies long before I saw Goldeneye. Tomorrow Never Dies, in many ways, was my formative impression of who Pierce Brosnan is as 007. Both Goldeneye and Tomorrow Never Dies are preoccupied with this foundational question for the Pierce Brosnan era. Does the James Bond character still make sense after the Cold War is over? Goldeneye is obsessed with the question, perhaps too obsessed with the question. Nearly every dialogue exchange in that movie is about recontextualizing the Bond character, about justifying his relevance in this new landscape. Tomorrow Never Dies takes a more effortless approach to that same question. In its opening few minutes, the pre-title sequence where Bond is at a terrorist arms bazaar on the Russian border, Bond has to establish his relevance in the wake of the Cold War. He's quite directly cleaning up the refuse of the Cold War in this opening sequence, and also simultaneously navigating the British bureaucracy. I would argue that Tomorrow Never Dies actually makes the much more efficient and succinct thematic statement about how Bond is still relevant after the Cold War has ended. Brevity is the soul of wit, as the saying goes, and Tomorrow Never Dies has a much more concise and witty expression of what it takes Goldeneye ultimately 2 hours to express. And so on that point, I'm already a little bit more inclined to be generous to Tomorrow Never Dies. Tomorrow Never Dies feels a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more effortless in its expression of who the Bond character is in the 1990s. He is the indestructible icon of glamour, navigating a new political landscape, an ailing political bureaucracy, and new technological threats. Pierce Brosnan, after all, is the true movie star Bond. In many ways, Brosnan's Bond feels like a throwback to a kind of glamour that precedes the Connery films. The glamour of Brosnan's Bond feels very much forged in this sense of 1930s elegance, the era in which Cary Grant really rose to stardom. And here in Tomorrow Never Dies, Pierce Brosnan is given his most glamorous wardrobe in all of his Bond run. He looks so elegant here. He looked great in Goldeneye too, but there's a sense of this slight awkwardness about Brosnan's Bond in Goldeneye. He's navigating this transition from the Timothy Dalton run into the Pierce Brosnan run, and you feel him grappling with the legacy of the character, and his look kind of matches that. It's a updated look for the 1990s, but in many ways, the suits still feel like they're slightly wearing Brosnan instead of Brosnan wearing them. By the time we get to Tomorrow Never Dies, Brosnan is owning the film frame, and he's owning everything he wears, and he's owning every line of dialogue. If you just pay attention to how much more comfortably Brosnan delivers one-liners in Tomorrow Never Dies versus Goldeneye, it's night and day. And that helps bolster the case for Tomorrow Never Dies being, in some ways, the stronger statement about Bond in the 90s. It really feels like this is the 1990s Bond, whereas Goldeneye feels a little bit like a hangover from the prior era. It's hard to argue that Tomorrow Never Dies is as strong narratively as Goldeneye. The one thing you can say about Goldeneye's script is that it's very sturdy. It has a cast of memorable, colorful characters who are engaged in a relatively coherent storyline. I don't know that you can say that Tomorrow Never Dies has a truly coherent storyline. It has a fairly clean plot with a fairly clearly delineated antagonist, but it doesn't feel as solid. The henchmen feel like afterthoughts. The Bond women this time out have thinner relationships to James Bond in the way they've been sketched. I find Paris Carver actually a very promising character. I even like Terry Hatcher's generally easy chemistry with Pierce Brosnan. I think they do banter together very well, but her character feels a little bit undercooked, and Wei Lin's relationship with James Bond gets off to a promising start, but also feels fairly perfunctory in the way that it develops. The romance for them comes out of nowhere, and there's not a lot of chemistry between Pierce Brosnan and Michelle Yeoh. They're both wonderful actors on their own terms, but together there's not exactly a strong spark. And that's a little bit different than the way that it plays in Goldeneye. I think the Natalia relationship in Goldeneye takes itself a little bit too seriously, given how little these characters have known each other, but there is genuine chemistry and romantic tension between Bond and Natalia, and Bond's antagonistic relationship with Xenia has a lot of fun in the way that Xenia exploits some of the core elements of Bond's hedonism. And of course, there's the main villain of these stories. Alec Trevelyan in Goldeneye is a fan favorite. People love Sean Bean's 006. And I have to admit, I love Sean Bean as an actor, and I think he's a worthy counterpoint to Pierce Brosnan. But I also don't think Goldeneye gives Sean Bean enough room to play. Narratively, we get very little time with 006 and Bond before 006 turns traitor, and after that, we don't really get that much in the way of interesting interaction between 006 and Bond. The story is moving aggressively forward in a way that doesn't allow for a lot of interesting byplay between the characters. I actually think 006 as a character is a little bit undercooked despite such excellent casting. I'm actually going to give the point here to Elliot Carver, who is in many ways just your standard over-the-top Bond villain, but actor Jonathan Pryce is so outrageously hammy and preposterous. He's actually one of the more satisfying villains in the series. When he finally gets his comeuppance at the end of Tomorrow Never Dies, it's a real thrill because this character has been such a mustache-twirling villain throughout the past 2 hours. The character is pretty thin on the page, but it's hard to say that Jonathan Pryce is not having the time of his life in this role, just delivering the most preposterous line readings you could come up with. Objectively, Elliot Carver is not as well written as 006, or at least not as coherently written. But in terms of just isolated scenes and line deliveries, I definitely have more fun with what Jonathan Pryce is doing with Elliot Carver than I do on a scene-by-scene basis with what Sean Bean is allowed to do with 006. And as much as Tomorrow Never Dies doesn't really have this great, strong, coherent narrative, I think the plot is very weak. It's hard to buy this World War III scenario between China and Britain, and the story structure is a little bit odd. It gets off to a very good start in Tomorrow Never Dies, but right around the point that Bond leaves Germany, the story loses some momentum. There's no real objective beyond just stopping Elliot Carver's plans, and we're stuck watching Bond uncover things that the audience already knows. It's not very satisfying, but what Tomorrow Never Dies does have that Goldeneye doesn't, is some really good set pieces sprinkled throughout the entire film. Goldeneye is a little bit uneven in the way that it distributes its action sequences. Everybody remembers the big, outrageous tank sequence that occurs partway through Goldeneye and kind of bridges into the climax. But Tomorrow Never Dies is peppered with these really fun, well-executed action beats, from the really thrilling one-upmanship of the opening sequence to the really delightful car chase to the slightly Roger Moore throwback bike chase sequence. All of these beats keep building up to a pretty explosive, very typically 1990s action climax, but the rhythms are a little bit more propulsive. I actually find that Tomorrow Never Dies keeps my interest a little bit more than Goldeneye. Goldeneye sags a bit after it has to reset when the tank chase is over. When Bond is going to Cuba in Goldeneye, there's this downtime moment where the film is resetting and it's build up to the climax, and it doesn't really quite recapture the momentum it had before. Tomorrow Never Dies may go heavy on the action to compensate for the thinness of the story, but at least that propulsive Bond pacing is there. I don't think either of these films fully captures the sweep of what I want in terms of Bond locations and that sort of exotic travelogue that was baked into the series when Ian Fleming began writing it so many decades ago. Goldeneye is very much focused on Cold War settings, Russia. It's very cold, it's drab, it's dreary. Yes, we get a little bit of Cuba, but it just feels like perfunctory photography. We're not really getting a sense for the setting. And Tomorrow Never Dies does even worse by that score. Tomorrow Never Dies is a film of steel, glass, and concrete. Even its great car chase is set inside of a parking garage. It's not exactly what I want in terms of Bondian sweep. Nevertheless, I'm going to give the point to Goldeneye just because of that wonderful Monte Carlo section of the film that really does tap into what I think is the height of 1990s Bond glamour. It's so lovely to see Bond in that part of the world, to see Bond in a casino. While I think Pierce Brosnan's Bond looks his most glamorous in Tomorrow Never Dies and has some of the most visually appealing moments as a character, that moment where he's taken off his dinner jacket and undone his tie and is just downing vodka, waiting for an assassin to come after him, is pure Bond. In fact, that moment could be one of the highlight reel moments for Brosnan's Bond. Goldeneye just captures a little bit more of the romanticism of the Bond fantasy in a way that Tomorrow Never Dies leans into 1990s techno thriller in a way that loses some of that Bond DNA. That said, Bond himself consistently looks glamorous enough that even when he's in these highly technological settings, he looks like a throwback to classic Hollywood glamour, and it still evokes that fantasy enough that it doesn't completely lose its way. That said, Goldeneye gets the point there. Goldeneye feels solid. It's like a meal that isn't exciting, but it's satiating, right? It fills you up and you feel nourished and you're ready to go to bed at the end of Goldeneye. Tomorrow Never Dies might not leave you quite as satiated, but the isolated elements on the dishes, even if they're not quite in the right proportion, are a little bit more exciting. They're a little bit more interesting. They've got a little bit more zest, a little bit more spice. And that's why, as of today, I'm inclined to say that Tomorrow Never Dies might get the edge here. Goldeneye will always hold its place for reasserting the Bond franchise's position in history. If Goldeneye hadn't been successful, the Bond series might have really just faded into oblivion. But Tomorrow Never Dies really feels like the film where this idea of the 90s Bond comes into its own. It's where Brosnan really owns the role, where the spectacle really starts to click for what a Bond movie can be in the form of a modern blockbuster. And honestly, it's just a lot more fun. One of the fundamental conflicts of the Brosnan era is how far to go with the dramatic aspects versus the fun aspects. And I think these films are a lot more successful with the fun facets than they are with some of the dramatic facets. And Tomorrow Never Dies is the Pierce Brosnan movie that really goes all in on the fun, and I'm here for it. So by all means, sound off in the comments, tell me how wrong I am. I really am excited to engage with you as always. And of course, I'll catch you in the next one.